there is a lot of diversity in the classroom. Students are coming to the classroom with their own cultural experiences, and they're not being addressed. And this is the problem that we're seeing, especially like with standardized testing. What is your take on that?
How best to teach a diverse group of students?
That, yes, exactly. And then
testing.
Talking and simple.
Right.
Yeah. However you like to go with it.
Right. You know, I was talking about Christine Sleater being really interested in policy. She just organized a policy summit. NAME had brought together leaders and staff from a number of organizations, as well as a bunch of scholars from Chicago and beyond, to kind of talk about, the summit was on quality teaching of culturally and linguistically diverse students. I think that was what it was called. So this is definitely something that NAME is very interested in as well. And I think that there are a lot of balancing that we need to find, right? There are people who say teachers need to learn about the cultures from which students come, right? And on the other hand, there are scholars who will say, but we should not think that we can get to a point where we understand the culture, right? Because then we end up oversimplifying and generalizing and essentializing and stereotyping. So there needs to be a balance between, on the one hand, saying I need to tailor my teaching to those differences, and on the other hand saying, but I need to acknowledge that who they are will always exceed what I can know, right, about them or their group. And that to me is a perfect example of what I like to call, you know, one of the central paradoxes of teaching, is that teaching should always kind of grapple with those kinds of contradictions, right, and not try to find that simplistic answer. It's kind of like saying, I need to teach critical perspectives on the world, but I also need to teach students and support students in questioning any perspective that I'm teaching, right? So critical pedagogy isn't about saying you need to get my critical take on things, right?
Yeah.
It needs to say both. You need to learn alternative views of the world, and you need to question any of them, right, including your own. So there's a lot of contradictions, and I think that's one of the things that we need to explore and take much more seriously, and I would say that's one of the directions that teacher preparation needs to go as well, is to refuse the simplistic answers, right? And one of those simplistic answers has to do with standardized tests as well, because you know, there are some who want to say we can get to a point where tests show us what students learn, and let's base everything on that, right? Whether they get promoted, whether teachers get raises, whether schools get turned around or not. And then there are people who say standardized tests are bad and we should completely reject them. And while I do have major concerns with standardized tests, and we can talk a little bit about them, I also acknowledge that we are in a time where standardized tests matter. And it's a disservice to our students to say, let's not pay attention to any of the tests, right? They need to learn, they need to be succeeding in those tests in order to move forward, and they need to learn how to navigate the norms and expectations of this world, including in schools. So I'm really swayed by some of the work of Lisa Delpit, right, who kind of talks about this notion of the culture of power. Culture of power is kind of like, you know, the unspoken rules for succeeding. You know, one of the things that she argues is that often the culture that permeates schools is the culture of the most privileged in society, right? And so they come to school already familiar with those rules for how to succeed. And it's everyone else who don't have the familiarity with those rules and that culture, that's one of the reasons they're struggling. So her argument is, you know, it's kind of in contrast to saying, if you come with different cultural expectations, I need to tailor my teaching to those differences. And Delpit would argue, well, the problem is, once they leave my classroom, they're back in the same situation, where they come with different expectations that don't match the rules for the dominant rules. So what Delpit says is, let's not ignore all the strengths that they bring, but let's teach them what it means. Let's teach them bicultural competence, right? Let's teach them what it means to succeed there versus what it means to succeed here. And I think standards and standardized testing in some ways gets at that, right? Because it's kind of making very explicit, here's the official knowledge. Here's the knowledge that some people think are most important. And you're at a disservice if you don't really get that, right? It kind of reminds me of when I was learning to teach. so this is when I was in college, some people would say, all right, you know, when you go for a job interview, there's certain things that they're gonna want to hear you talk about, because that means you know how to plan a lesson, or it means you know cognitive development of students, you know. So can you talk about, you know, certain ways of thinking about cognitive development? Can you talk about Bloom's taxonomy? Can you talk about, you know, backward design or whatever? And that means you've learned, right? And so if we're learning all these alternative things, that's great. But if I walk into an interview but they're looking for these other things, I'm at a disservice if I can't talk about them. So it doesn't mean I need to believe that that's the best way. It means I need to know that that's expected of me, right? So I think so. There's a balance that needs to be found with the contradictions around standardized tests as well. But what I was going to say was some of my concerns with standardized tests, because I'm actually writing about this right now. I think that there's a number of concerns that don't often get articulated, right? We talk a lot, for example, about cultural bias in the content of the tests, and that still exists, and that will always exist, right? I would argue that any book that you pick up comes from certain perspectives. It reflects certain stories, and it doesn't reflect others, right? Exactly. Any lesson you teach, same thing. Any textbook you teach, same thing. Any test you use, same thing, right? That's sort of the nature of language, it's the nature of text, it's the nature of story, it's the nature of whatever. But there are other problems. You know, a second problem I would point to is how we construct norm-reference tests. So first of all, there's this interesting thing about talking about standards-based curriculum, but using norm-reference tests as a way to kind of assess whether students are learning. If you want to pursue standards-based curriculum, you need standards-based assessments, right? Which are not the same thing as norm-reference assessments. Standards-based assessments are how well are you meeting the standards. Norm reference is how do you compare with the norm group? How well do you compare to other students, right? And the question of how you compare to other students is sort of irrelevant if what you're asking is any given student meeting those particular standards, right? So the kind of alignment of the goals of the curriculum with the assessment tools has to be really carefully thought. But there's also the question of how do we construct norm-reference tests. So norm-reference tests, like the SAT, you know, there are often questions on the SAT that do not count towards your score, right? These are questions that we put on the test to kind of figure out how do people score on them. And if the distribution of the scores look like what the other question, the regular test questions looks like, then it's a sign that that's a question that works, right? That's a question that's going to give us the kind of scoring that we want, right? If the people who normally do well on tests are all failing that question, then doesn't that mean there's something wrong with the question? Okay, this is the kind of thinking that test design, this is how you make a norm reference test, right? So what's the point here? The point is that scholars have argued we construct a test so that the scores look the way that they've always looked, right? That's what it means to have a norm reference test, is that the norm group continues to do the way that we expect them to do really well. So we're constructing tests in ways that disadvantage certain groups of students. So that's another thing.
That is true.
The final thing I would say about standardized tests is how are we using the tests, right? We've moved to a time right now where we think that high stakes testing is a good thing, right? It's determining which students get promoted, how we evaluate teachers, how we evaluate schools, and so on. Well, one of the interesting contradictions is that we're claiming that the use of standardized tests is going to lead to improvements in education for the students who are struggling the most. But when we look at what's going on in the schools where students are not doing well on tests, what's actually happening? When schools show that students are not scoring well, there's all these things that happen, right? There's all these sanctions. So there's extra reporting that has to happen, right? So there's less percentage of my time is now spent on teaching and curriculum and service, right? It's actually now spent on reporting stuff, meeting all these other requirements.